Hi, folks. Dave Berkowitz here. After the stock market closed on Friday, Moody's reduced the United States government's credit rating from stable to negative, citing large fiscal deficits. Who knew? The ratings agency said that continued political polarization in Congress raises the risk that lawmakers will not be able to reach a consensus on a plan to slow the decline in debt affordability. The question was, will bond and stock prices tumble on Monday again, as they did after Fitch Ratings downgraded U.S. debt on August 1st? I doubted it. We all know that fiscal policy is out of control, and so do the markets. The rallies in bond and stock markets since the start of November have been driven by perceptions that the Fed is done tightening, that inflation is continuing to moderate, that bond yields are high enough to attract sufficient demand to buy the government debt, and that the soft landing scenario is still the most likely economic outlook, at least for now. The rally in the S&P, this one here, 500, since the October 27th low of the correction that started on July 31st, quickly raised the index above its 50-day and 200-day moving average. It's likely that the move higher will hit some resistance around here, around 4550, 4500. And as shown here, we could get to Dr. Ed Yardeni's 4600 target by year end, and it could be a breakout move for early in 2024. P. Morgan Chase's CEO, Jamie Dimon, kicked off the Q3 earnings season in October with a stern warning to investors. He said, "Now may be the most dangerous time the world has seen in decades." And just like that, Dimon sounded the alarm on the global effects of the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. He warned of far-reaching impacts on energy and food markets, global trade and geopolitical relationships. And of course, he talked about stock and bond markets. What is he talking about? He's talking about, first and foremost, the American peace that prevailed for 30 years following the collapse of the Soviet Union has ceased to function. The two major countries that were supposed to be liberalizing their governance and economies have instead opted out of what President Obama termed the international community. China and Russia, both experiencing rapid demographic collapse, have returned to their isolated, authoritarian, bellicose ways, with Russia and the West in a proxy war in Ukraine, and China threatening not just Taiwan, but all of its neighbors in the region, and ultimately the United States. Xi and Putin skipped the most recent G20 meeting in India. But some good news, Chairman Xi is supposed to come this week to the APEC summit, which is going to be held in San Francisco. Maybe you've seen that Governor Gavin Newsom is frantically cleaning up San Francisco to welcome Chairman Xi and the other members. The Middle East has once again denigrated into genocidal conflict. Iran edges steadily closer to a nuclear capability. Afghanistan is returning to the darkness after our bug out. Our southern border has ceased to exist. Millions of migrants are entering the country, devastating local economy and creating an intolerable burden in large cities. The government is waging a war of extinction against our innovative and productive oil and gas industry, even as the government draws down our strategic petroleum reserve to a matter of only a few days' supply. America's energy independence, not to mention its opportunity to become Europe's go-to energy source at Russia's significant cost, by the way, is under relentless attack by our own government. Both Medicare and Social Security are on a clear path to insolvency. That's what this summer's reports by the trustees said. And it's made worse and closer to insolvency by inflation. And inflation, of course, remains stubbornly high, especially in the services sector, sapping the incomes of America's middle class. With the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate around 8%, the highest since 2000, home affordability is at its worst level since at least 1989. The National Association of Realtors Housing Affordability Index has declined by nearly 50% since 2020 alone. The median mortgage payment in the U.S. is now the highest on record, and so is the asking rent price for a single-family home. Let's look back 53 years to another quote-unquote dangerous time in the United States. We just landed on the moon in 1969 using a huge, less powerful computer than the iPhone that's in our hands today. Isn't that amazing? Here's phones, televisions, cars, and computers in 1970, just to give you a reference point. The first 5 months of 1970 saw the cataclysmic terminal phase of a bear market in stocks that had begun back in the presidential election month of November of 1968. Itself was a terrible year during which Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were murdered and the sitting president was driven from office. That bear market, stretching over 18 months, drove the S&P 500 index down a total of 36%. This was, at the time, the most significant decline since the 1930s. Only a couple of weeks after announcing that over 100,000 American troops were being withdrawn from Vietnam, President Nixon, on April 30th, 1970, went on television and announced to a stunned nation that the United States had invaded Cambodia. Virtually every American college campus erupted in a firestorm of rage. At Kent State University in Ohio, young National Guards with little training fired on the student demonstrators, killing 4 of them. Suddenly, after living in mounting hope that the nightmare of Vietnam was finally in the process of ending, our country was torn apart all over again. 1970 was also a year of environmental pessimism. The world was held to be running entirely out of resources, even as the global population exploded. The author of the vast best-selling book titled The Population Bomb appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show upwards of 24 times, cheerfully predicting that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the coming decade. This is Paul Ehrlich, The Population Bomb, and here he is on one of his Tonight Show appearances. Finally, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 had created a post-war financial construct in which the world's currencies were effectively pegged to the U.S. dollar. That entire system rested on our commitment, the United States' commitment, to buy and sell gold at $35 an ounce. But the cancer of inflation was by 1970 metastasizing apace. By year-end, going off the gold standard was no longer an if, but a when. The answer to when was August of the following year, but that fact is irrelevant. In 1970, the entire post-World War II financial system was about to be repealed, and no one could even imagine what chaos might follow. Mobile phone, internet searches, personal computers, or Zoom meetings, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Netflix, Tesla, Facebook, Apple, and NVIDIA did not exist in 1970. It isn't just that these capabilities and companies were not anticipated or predicted by anyone in 1970. We must observe that in 1970, these instruments and the companies that provided them were completely inconceivable. Investors in 1970 weren't even thinking along these lines. Instead, their attention was probably riveted on the political, geopolitical, environmental, financial, and economic horror that unfolded daily throughout that year. It was indeed a dangerous time. So what should we do with Jamie Dimon's warning now? Let's look what happened to investors in 1970. Notice that the cash income produced by the S&P 500, the dividends, has increased nearly 3 times the inflation rate, or the CPI, right here. So you can see that we were up eight times as of this year. But the dividend itself, the one that was paid by all those 500 companies, was up 22 times, which is just about 3 times what inflation did. So if there's just one critical statistic that investors must know, this is it. Most of the 10,000 people retiring in America every single day through at least 2029, when the youngest baby boomer turns 65, that's me, by the way, do not know it. For perspective, in the 53 years since the end of 1970, the S&P 500, including intraday panic bottoms, has declined at least 20% 12 times. Let me repeat that. 12 times the stock market has gone down 20% since 1970. The three largest of those declines were down 48%, down 49%, and down 57%. Yet, here we are, not counting the reinvestment of dividend, 48 times higher. $10,000 invested in the index at the end of 1970 and left to compound, taxes paid from another source, is, as I write, worth about $2 million. And the compound annual growth rate has been 10.5% through all those bad times. Along the way, the longest it has taken for the index investor to break even with reinvested dividends is 5 years and 8 months. And only some of the 53-year-old Americans know this, and now you do too. Thanks. Thanks for reading. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. Bye-bye.